With every new console generation comes new games, competition, and new way to make games. Going from 8 to 16-bit era, we got a better chance to flesh out a plot. From 16 to a purely polygonal era, we got a better chance to express the emotions that the characters were feeling and try to make a more cinematic experience. Now that's if you go off of Final Fantasy's history. Some will adapt like Konami did to an extent with the Suikoden series. Others died off like the Breath of Fire series when they released a game that shall remain nameless. My point is that we had to wait till 2001 before Squaresoft would release Final Fantasy X. In the time between Final Fantasy 9 and 10, it was a very eventful time. They dropped a ton of money on the Final Fantasy movie called The Spirits Within, released a couple of launch titles for the PS2 in the Bouncer and X Squad, and this would be a kind of a make-or-break game for not only Square EA, but for Square-Enix, and I'll go into more of it later. Now keep in mind when I say this, I'm talking more so in terms of sales. Around this time, I felt Squaresoft didn't really have a true threat in the RPG market like in the PlayStation 1 era. Sure, the Elder Scrolls series was on the rise with Morrowind coming out soon, Suikoden was still around, Kingsfield got a spin-off, and Eternal Ring, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance was a hit, and Grandia got a sequel. The problem is that none of them were top-tier threats. The Elder Scrolls series didn't build the dynasty that Bethesda has now until Oblivion, which came out a generation later. Not to mention, Kingsfield was a cult classic franchise at best, and that goes for Wild Arms, Grandia, and Suikoden. Not to mention, Airplay was slowly on its way out of business due to some really bad business decisions with its license. From a development standpoint, they all had respect for one another, but while it was a heated competition for who did the best RPGs, Squaresoft was more concerned with how badly they were bleeding money from the flop that was Square Pictures. So now that I went off such a tangent that got its own paragraph, let's get into the development of the game, shall we? The game's development was done by some familiar suspects, but a noteworthy omission is Hironobu Sakaguchi. For those who don't know, after the huge mistake in Square Pictures, Hironobu Sakaguchi stepped down as executive producer and, in my opinion, probably figured he needed a break from the pressures of being a high-level executive and took a good chunk of the blame for the fall from grace that the industry giant Square-Enix took. This time around, Yoshinori Kitase directed and produced the game. Yusuke Naora handled the art. Handling the story was three people: Kazuki Nojima, Daisuke Watanabe, and Motomu Toriyama. And finally handling the music was Masashi Mazu, Junya Nakano, along with Nobuo Yumimatsu. History lesson time. As far as new members, and according to Wikipedia, Daisuke Watanabe had previously worked on one other game before Final Fantasy X called Threads of Fate. He would go on to have a hand in writing the scenario for Final Fantasy X-2, 12, the Final Fantasy XIII series, the Kingdom Hearts franchise, the City of Final Fantasy, and the ill-fated Front Mission Evolved, and is currently working on Final Fantasy XV as the lead scenario writer. So he has some good games on his resume, but it's been more up and down as far as quality. This was also the first big project for Masashi Hamazu. Previously, he had worked on the music for the first Front Mission game, not the grid-based RPG, Tokball No. 1, Chocobo no Fushigina Dungeon, and Saga Frontier 2. He would go on to have music in games like Unlimited Saga, Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII, the Final Fantasy XIII series, Half Minute Hero Second Coming, the HD ports of Final Fantasy X and X-2, and most recently, The Legend of Legacy, among others. Half of the games he has worked on are Japan-only releases, and for the most part, he's worked on quality music. Finally, Junya Nakano was a bit of a reliable guy for music. Before Final Fantasy X, he had worked on arcade games like Asterix, Martial Champion, Mystic Warriors, and X-Men, but he also did music for games like Threads of Fate, the first Front Mission game, along with Front Mission Alternative, which became to North Americans known as the original Front Mission, Tobal 1, and a really obscure Japanese game called Another Mind. He would also go on to work on music for games such as the ill-fated Project Sylphid, Musashi Samurai Legend, the DS remake of Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy XIII, Dawn of Mana, among others. So fundamentally, this is a good chunk of the team who would go on to work on Final Fantasy XIII, so if you want to direct your hate mail anywhere, send it there. Moving right along, let's get into the plot of Final Fantasy X. The plot of Final Fantasy X is told compelling enough. You play as Tidus, the son of a great blitzball player. In the middle of a big game, a gigantic monster known as Sin attacks and destroys his hometown Zanarkand. Along with his friend Auron, he gets teleported to a new land called Spira, which is where our game takes off. You will encounter many characters such as the summoner Yuna, who is said to be destined to defeat Sin, the badass Guardian Kimahri, Black Mage Lulu, among others. Yes, the story can be telegraphed a mile away and is cliche, but it's told on an epic scale through the eyes of an outsider looking in. Tidus, while easily one of the most hated main heroes in the franchise, still pulls off the job he was supposed to do fairly effectively. The graphics at the time were state-of-the-art. The world of Final Fantasy X is in all cases a step above Final Fantasy IX. The world is completely in 3D, the textures looked great, and everything about it looked like a next-generation game. Monsters went from blocky to gorgeous, and the bosses looked like they were ready to have you get into a full-on war with them. My only real problem is that this came at the cost of the size of the world. The game is probably 1/4 the size of Final Fantasy IX. I would let it slide if the game didn't take out about 90% of the elements that made games like Final Fantasy IX feel like a planet, but more on that later. Aside from that, it does a really good job of showing what a cinematic experience can be on the PlayStation 2. Sure, it's dated by today's standards, but for a 2001 game, this felt like a full-fledged movie. Yeah, the design, the characters can be off-the-wall wacky, but pick at stuff like it is really reaching. The audio is also well done. The music is incredible yet again. I love pretty much all of it. It's also probably used like in 90% of the games in the series. Just the way the opening scene plays out and gives you a moment how much is on the line. Like the fifth world is in their hands. For how much I didn't care for Tidus, even the love scene between Tidus and Yuna is very well done in general. Sure, they are at times awkward, and quite frankly, she could have a love interest with Kimahri and it would have been no different. The thing is, when they do happen, Nobuo Uematsu has this way with music that makes you care about their romance despite how weak it plays out. The voice acting for the most part is well done. This is the first fully voice acted game in the franchise. Every voice actor did an incredible job of putting on a movie level performance. Some of the better actors were the people who played as Auron, Kimahri, Yuna, and Seymour. The way the game plays out Auron's storyline is so well done that it makes you think we missed out on a much better game. Yes, I know there are some cheesy lines and some bad voice actors such as people who played as Riku and Tidus. I would agree with them fully. Tidus comes off as whiny as much plot filler as Vaughn. I can't stand the guy at all, and you can't defend how he's acted. You can defend how he's written, but it doesn't excuse how he always comes off like a 9-year-old who got trophies for putting the toilet seat down. Riku, on the other hand, is everything I hate about fake blonde tomboy girls. This chick comes off as dumb as every cliche about blondes. Just the way she interacts with people in a way, I'm surprised she didn't try to sleep with every character in the game. Even with those factors in mind, it's still a well-performed game. The gameplay is decent at best. For all it tries to be a cinematic experience, the gameplay needed either a few more months in the shop or a total overhaul. No wonder they released it a few months later worldwide. There's only 2 or 3 different kinds of gameplay. Fundamentally, you go from town to town unlocking summons, fighting enemies, and typical stuff in a role-playing game like this. The combat system is somewhat familiar, but it tries to reinvent itself. The game lowers the party limit from 5 to 3. You can switch mid-battle with every character you have, and it adds strategy to the fights. How the fights work is that every character is on this ladder to the side. The character portrait who is going to make an action next is at the top. The more of that portrait you see of them, the more often they get attacks. You do stuff like cast haste to get more moves more often, cast slow to reduce how many moves your opponent has, or delay their attacks by using certain attacks. Now, where the game really feels different is in leveling up. The game gets rid of the traditional leveling up system for a more customizable way in the Spirit Grid. Every battle you get a certain amount of experience points. Get enough of them and you get a level up. You can spend these points and use certain items called spears to level up stats, get new abilities, or unlock new areas on the Spirit Grid that were locked to them. My biggest problem is that while it's a cool idea, outside of each character's special attack and base stats, they all feel like templates. Every character goes over the same spears and get the same moves as everyone else because it loops together in a big circle. I heard they fixed it in the International Edition and the HD remaster of Final Fantasy X, but I doubt it's all that much deeper. I like the attempt at something that could be really cool and innovative. The problem is that at the end of the day, it feels unfinished and needed more time to be fleshed out. Probably the biggest side quest in the game is the Blitzball minigame. Most people hate this plot-crucial minigame. While I think there's fun to be had with this minigame, I tend to hate it more so because it feels like a cop-out on making a good side quest. I say it's a cop-out that, and upon further research, this has a lot of similar elements to a game called Tecmo World Cup Soccer. It has so many similar elements that if you broke both games down to fundamental gameplay, then they are pretty much the same game. Each game has you spend health points to pass, shoot, or to stop shots. Each game has it where you can try to get around players to get a better move, and both have where it goes to a turn-based strategy game for you to do those things such as passing, shooting, and so forth. It's fundamentally the same game. They even have RPG elements to them. I know there's drawing elements to a game, but to me, this feels like a copy and paste job. Now, I got a couple of significant problems with this game. The first is that the game just feels a lot more linear and smaller. Final Fantasy X doesn't feel like a world. Every level has one way to get from point A to point B. Sure, there's alternative areas to explore, but the game doesn't have an overworld so you can go to places you weren't supposed to. This turns every area into more of a dungeon rather than a free-for-all world. Not to mention that airship makes the game even more linear. Instead of having to find every town on the world map, you can automatically teleport to any area you have already been to. This is a big deal to me looking back at it because it takes a lot of the sense of discovery out of the game. You no longer have to find the towns based on your memory on a world map. You could be looking for a town you have already been to and find another dungeon unintentionally. That was one of those really cool elements in those games that is not in here anymore. Another problem is that the game is way too easy. Sure, there's the monster capturing side quest which can create mega bosses to fight, and there's extra dungeons you can go do which can get ridiculously hard. The problem is that the main quest is a joke. You'll blow through 90% of the game with almost no challenge. Sure, there are some tough boss fights, but every RPG has them. There are so many ways to abuse the spirit grid that it's probably one of the easiest Final Fantasy games I have ever played. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a solid role-playing game. There's tactics to choose and when to switch out characters in fights, and fundamentally, it's not the worst role-playing game out there. The problem is that at the end of the day, the game still has characters that feel like soulless templates in combat, doesn't feel like a free-for-all world, and it just doesn't live up to the standards that Final Fantasy had set for. Overall, Final Fantasy X is a good game, but not a great game. It was hyped to be the standard that all RPGs would have to follow, and I think it was for a while. The problem is that over time, I think it won't age as well as Final Fantasy IX. Not to say it's a bad game. The graphics are great, the music is good, it has solid gameplay elements, and there's a fair bit of value with the game clocking in around 20 to 30 hours for the main story and around 80 hours or more with side quests. The problem is that it took a big step backward from 9. I give it an 8 out of 10. If you haven't played a Final Fantasy game before, 10 is not a bad place to start.